All right, good. So where was I? All right, so again, you are, if you don't know where you're at, you're in the Gospel of Matthew in its first century Jewish context. Again, as I tried to make the point last week, I think I beat it to death, is a lot of people can study the gospel from a Jewish perspective, but that doesn't mean they let it sink in, and that's what we want to hopefully do today. All right, so, and I mentioned this last week too, I think. When you think about the Gospel of Matthew, this is the vision I want you to have in your mind. The Sea of Galilee, where so much of this story takes place. I think this is very much the focus of Matthew's narrative, and it's a important visual to hold on to. All right, so whoops. Okay, so the theme of today's lesson is the arrival of the shepherd king, the end of the exile, and the restoration of Israel. And all this in 4 chapters of the Gospel of Matthew. But if you give me time, I think we'll be able to unpack that and we'll see how it sort of plays out. All right, so we begin again by a quick review of those individuals who write a lot in the New Testament, but are at odds with what I think are the correct biblical view. So again, I know I mentioned right last week, but I elaborated a little bit with another comment that I think is important. I'll go over these very quickly because we talked about them last time, but I want to sort of use this as a springboard to get into the discussion. Here's something that Wright wrote in his book, Jesus and the Victory of God. Right is wrong, just for the record. So he wrote, the expectation of the restored land has become focused on restored human beings. The pearl of great price was available for those who sold everything. Now that part is true, I agree. Among the things that would have to be sold was the traditional symbol of sacred land itself. It was swallowed up in the eschatological promise of restored human lives and human communities through the coming of Jesus. Well, I would disagree with that final part of his statement, and I'll try to show you why. People are still coming in, which is great. So he continues, Jesus has come to bring Israel to her, quote, return from exile, which is true, but as this will not underwrite Israel's ethnic aspirations, so it will reaffirm her symbolic and zealously defended territorial inheritance and possession. On the contrary, the unfaithful tenants will have their vineyard taken away. And that, I think, is not correct, and I'll try to unpack that as we go. He added also, we mentioned this last week, the promises to Jerusalem design are now transferred to Jesus and his people. The church has taken the place occupied by Jewish ethnic identity. Again, things that I think are not correct. Gary Burge, another New Testament scholar, writes, Jesus is surprisingly silent with regard to the territorial aspirations and politics of his day. I hope by the end of today's discussion that we can challenge that claim that Jesus is surprisingly silent. I don't think he's silent at all about any of these things, and certainly Matthew's not. Stephen Sizer wrote, the New Testament knows nothing of this preoccupation with an earthly kingdom. He sort of says that preoccupation, that it's like this negative sort of self-absorbed kind of a concept, but simply not true. And it goes on and on and on. Colin Chapman says basically the same thing. Jesus has had very little to say specifically about the land. Again, not true. Well, what's interesting is that you can't have it both ways. On the one hand, these New Testament scholars argue that the Gospels and the New Testament as a whole have nothing to say about the land, about the land promise or the territorial restoration of Israel. While on the other hand, when the text does say something about the land, they argue that these promises have been transformed, air quotes, transformed and transferred to the church. So Again, either Israel gets nothing, Jesus had nothing to say about it. But if, on the other hand, they say, well, he did say something, but it doesn't apply to Israel or the Jewish people anymore. So you can't have it both ways. And we'll sort of unpack that as well. Okay, so uh, I want to begin by laying the foundation for some of the things that we want to think about, to talk about. And one of the most important things that we need to uh, one of the things that we need to understand is the Deuteronomic meta-narrative of Matthew. And by that, what do I mean? Let me see. By the way, I need to check one thing. Hang on one second. Sorry. I have to end show for 1 second and see, are we recording? Is this recording? I need to double check. Sorry. Sorry, just want to make sure I'm recording. Yes, I am recording. Sorry. Just needed to check real quick. We're good. Sorry. Okay, I will share again. And we can continue. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. All right, so we need to understand the Deuteronomic meta-narrative of the Gospel of Matthew. Does anybody out there know what I mean by that before I dive in? What do we mean by the meta-narrative?
Big picture.
Right, exactly. The big picture, the overarching story that ties everything together. And so what we need to understand is that the book of Deuteronomy provides that meta-narrative, that big story of the Bible that ties it together. In what way? It's in this way. And that's there. We could spend a whole chapter, a whole hour and a half just talking about this, but we won't. So I'll just summarize it. But this is a key idea. And if this is new to you, I hope that you'll begin to explore it more as you study the Bible, because it's really so important. And that Deuteronomic meta-narrative is this, from Deuteronomy chapter 28 through 30, namely that section in Deuteronomy about the promise of curses and blessings. Now, what did God promise? For the sake of time, I'll just summarize it. But what did God tell Israel at the end of the book? He said, if you sin, and that pretty clearly did happen, when you sin, what will happen? Well, a bunch of things will happen on the road to the worst thing that would happen to Israel. When Israel sinned, God said there are a number of things would take place. The land would sort of turn against you. You wouldn't get rain. All these things that God would do to punish the nation of Israel for its covenant disobedience, its failure to keep the law of Moses. But what was the ultimate punishment? The ultimate punishment was, of course, exile. Like I said, rain, that was pretty bad. Why did God make Israel a nation of farmers in the middle of basically the desert? Not the best choice in my mind to make Israel a nation in the middle of the desert. If you want to have a society that depends on farming, go for the Amazon jungle or somewhere like that. I don't know if you can really farm the Amazon jungle, but you get the idea. But no, God put them in the desert. Why? And he forbid them from irrigating the land so that they would depend on him for rain. How do they get rain? By being faithful to the covenant. When they failed to keep the covenant, God withheld the rain. But that wasn't as bad as it would get. Ultimately, God said, when you fail to keep the covenant, I will remove you from the land. I will drive you into exile. Now, that's where sadly, most New Testament scholars stop. They say, yeah, Israel into exile, sort of end of story. God's judged them and they're done. But that's not where God stopped the narrative, because he said, in Deuteronomy, but when you repent, wherever you are, I will gather you back and bring you back to the land. I will restore you from exile. So this meta narrative of sin, exile, and restoration are in the very DNA of Matthew's gospel, and are actually many books of the New Testament. And we have to understand this when we're reading the text. Any questions about that? All right. So everyone's being so quiet. All right. So I want to begin where we need to. Matthew 1, verses 1 through 17. Now, I'm not going to read the whole genealogy because it'll use up time that I want to use on the fulfillment quotations that we're going to talk about. But it's important that we understand its function. So we'll look at verse 17 in particular, but I'll just do this. I'll point out, as you probably already know, that Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 16 contains the genealogy of Jesus. Now, how many of you guys have ever gotten bogged down into one of these debates about Matthew's genealogy versus differences in Luke's genealogy? Okay, a few of you. This is a point of constant debate about with people, and I understand there's a lot of critical issues, but trust me, these differences that exist between Matthew's gospel and Luke's gospel, I think they can be resolved, but we may not be the ones that are able to resolve them because we just don't have all the information. But the truth is, Matthew has an agenda in using his genealogy. Clearly, there are not enough names in this genealogy to go from beginning of the very beginning to the very end. There's only see how I sort of escape trying to figure out how many names there's exactly supposed to be. But he's given us 3 groups of 14 names. Now, why has he done that? What is the purpose of these 14 names? And by the way, what is the, well, I'll come back to that in a minute, but just as you're looking at it, what is the main occupation of the middle group of names? Anybody notice right away?
Kings.
Exactly, kings. We'll come back to that in a minute, but that will stand out as important in a second. But anyway, the point is, I want you to notice that we have 3 groups of names, beginning obviously with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs, and concluding with this middle, or the second group, beginning with David, consisting of all kings. And then finally, you have the names of the last group from, I've divided them by supplying there's a tension about a missing, it actually doesn't add up correctly if you don't know how to fill in the names. But you'll notice I've given in the first group of names, the 14th name is David the king, and in that verse it repeats the name of David twice, which begins the second group. David ends with Josiah. Third group begins with Jeconiah and ends with Jesus. All right, but what I want you to notice in particular is this, is the summary verse in verse 17. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, or to the Christ, 14 generations. Now, it's fascinating that in this whole genealogy, the only event that's sort of recorded there is the deportation or the exile. More on that in a second. But so all that to say, why has he broken this group into 14 generations or 14 names? So what's the answer? I've sort of given it to you in the notes, but 14 is a important number because because Matthew can use it to get the name David. It's what is called in Hebrew a gematria, meaning sort of a a word play using numbers where the letters in Hebrew add up to have a numeric value, and they add up to the number 14. So the letter D, or Dalet in Hebrew, has a numeric value of 4. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet. Vav has a numeric value of 6. And so 4 plus 6, what do we need to get 14? Is you need another Dalet, or number 4. So you got 14. So you've got 3 groups of 14 names. Now, just out of curiosity, I'm sure many of you already knew that already. I'm assuming, how many of you were familiar with that already? Okay, good. A few of you. So this is important. Why? Because Matthew's genealogy is historically accurate, or biologically accurate. Let me be clear on that 100%. But its main function is theological. This is a theological genealogy because Matthew's using it to make a point. I am embarrassed to say this is a very American observation, but I watched Jerry Springer one too many times. If any of you ever saw it, you'll know what I'm talking about. You also should be ashamed of yourself for watching it. But they'd always have people on there where they were debating whether somebody was somebody's father, and they had a paternity test, which was crazy and ridiculous to watch. See, I shouldn't have confessed that, but I was young. But anyway, the point is, this is not the function of Matthew's genealogy. It's really serving a theological function because he wants to arrive at the number 14. So he's given us three groups of 14 generations each. So the genealogy of Jesus corresponds to the history of Israel. You've got from Abraham to David the king, verses 2 through 6, right? Then you've got from David again, actually beginning in verse 6, to the Babylonian exile, or Jeconiah. And then finally, you've got from the Babylonian exile to Jesus. Now, one way we can sort of map that out, which is interesting, is by looking at it like this. It begins with Abraham, verse 2, and it goes to David. Again, I said David the king. How many of you are using a Bible that has David the king in verse 6? Does it say David the king twice, or does it just say David the king and then David? Look at verse 6. What does it have? Anyone?
David, King David, and then David.
Correct. Good. Now, the King James Bible will say, I think it says David the king twice. Anybody out there using King James? Well, if you look at the King James, it'll say David the king twice, I believe, but that is not correct. It's
It does.
it does, right? Well, it's
Yes.
actually David the king and then David. So in this sort of first graph line, the genealogy goes from Abraham to David the king, and it was good to be David the king, right? And it was good to be part of David's kingdom. Everybody knew if you mess with David, you're messing with the God of Israel, and he would take you out. But David the king was also David the sinner. And that brings us to that second movement in the genealogy, which goes from David the sinner, who got in trouble with Bathsheba, to the exile. And the exile sort of functioning as a name here, really, or as a placeholder. But you could argue for the last king there as well, Jeconiah. And so David the king, aka David the sinner, leads the path on these groups of kings who lead the nation on down this path of destruction, all culminating in the exile, this ultimate act of God's judgment. Now, again, this is where a lot of people are content to stop. God punished Israel. Yeah, God's done with Israel. Of course, that's what all the nations were rejoicing about when they thought about this. And this is where, even today, despite what the text says, a lot of New Testament scholars are willing to stop in terms of God's dealings with the nation of Israel. Yes, he brought them back from exile, but they remained in spiritual exile, and God was basically done with them.
Oh my goodness.
Somebody's microphone is not muted. Could you mute that, please? But that is not where God ends the story, or at least Matthew certainly doesn't end the story there. Why? Because the exile, the bottom of the, the end, the bottom, life is over, is not the end of Israel's story. Why? Because it culminates in the ultimate son of David, Jesus the Messiah, in verse 16. And so you can sort of like map out the genealogy like that. And it's fascinating how you can see God's dealings with the nation displayed in that way. All right, so all that to say, just thinking about it holistically, what is the genealogy's function? Sorry, was there a question? Okay, somebody's unmuted. Could you mute yourself? Thank you. Good. Okay, so all that to say, what is the genealogy's function? And this is important so we know how to use the genealogy. The genealogy, in other words, is not just a list of names to verify that Jesus's credentials are kosher. It is exactly that on one hand. On the other hand, Matthew's giving us a lens, an interpretive grid through which the story. What was that movie? Did anybody see it with Nicolas Cage about he steals the Declaration of Independence and you need the glasses to read it? Is that ringing a bell with anybody? No, I'm dating myself or showing I watched.
Yeah, that was a good movie.
Yes, but what was the name of that movie?
National Treasure.
National Treasure Rush. Thank you. Right. And what did you need to read right? It was on the back of the Declaration of Independence. There was a treasure map. And what did you need to read that map?
Glasses.
Right. You needed Benjamin Franklin's glasses, I believe. Anyway, they were an interpretive grid that revealed the treasure map. Matthew's genealogy is working in the exact same way, although more inspired. It is giving us the interpretive grid through which Matthew wants us to read the story. And if you don't have that grid, if you don't have those glasses or those lenses, you end up possibly with the wrong interpretation. And that is why so many scholars will say, yeah, Matthew's got this really negative view of Israel or a hostile view of this or that or the other thing. It's because they're not reading it through the right lens. So that is why Matthew's genealogy is there. It's not simply to verify the genealogical credentials of the Messiah. It's absolutely there for that reason, but he's giving it to us as the grid through which he wants us to read the rest of the story. So how is the genealogy function? It functions like this. The genealogy stresses the fulfillment of God's covenant with David. All of Israel's history from the very beginning with Abraham is about God's covenant with David. From Abraham to David the king, about God's covenant with David. I used to remember DVDs when there were things that played music. That was a long time ago. I thought that was like so modern. Anyway, I got to quit dating myself again. All right. So from Abraham to David the king, God's covenant with David. From David the king to the exile, God's covenant with David. From the exile to the time of Jesus the Messiah, about God's covenant with David. That is what this story is about. It's about God fulfilling his covenant with David. Secondly, the genealogy stresses the theme, as I said, of sin exile, and restoration. They form the substructure of the genealogy and the whole story. Thirdly, the genealogy reveals that Jesus's arrival has brought about the end of Israel's exile. Yes, it's true the exile ended sort of physically, but it wasn't really over in its fullest sense or in its spiritual sense. It wasn't the end of exile that the prophets were talking about. And of course, things didn't go well when they came back from exile, and they didn't all come back from exile. So Matthew is saying that Israel's exile has come to an end at last for real. He's brought an end to the exile. And then fourth, the genealogy signals that the eschatological restoration of Israel has begun. So these are all these ideas that are bound up and wound up in the genealogy. Okay, any questions about that before I go on?
No.
Carmela, did you have a question? No?
No.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So anyway, this is the grid that we need to have when we read the story. And that is the function of the genealogy. Yes, it confirms that Jesus is from the line of David and he's the king of Israel. But it's also this grid to read the whole story. And that's worth the price of admission. Okay. So that's the first point I want to talk about. All right. Now let's talk about Matthew's geography of restoration. This is so important to reading the story. What's different about Matthew's gospel than Luke or John or Mark's gospel? In Matthew's gospel, it's pretty much in the Galilee. Now, it's true that, of course, in chapters 19 through the first half of 28, you have a return to Judea and Jerusalem. But that's because he needs to get the business done of, dying for the sins of the nation and redeeming humanity. But you have in chapter 1 through 4, you have, to verse 11, you have the presentation of the shepherd king, the messianic shepherd king. But the majority of the story takes place in the Galilee and its environs. Jesus has one objective, and that's to go to the Galilee in Matthew's gospel. In the other gospels, you see him going back and forth between Jerusalem and the Galilee and to the outer regions. But in Matthew's gospel, he has one mission, and that's to go to the Galilee. And so after his resurrection, where does he go? He goes back to the Galilee to meet the disciples. So this is hugely important in reading this story. And so there is a tremendous importance to seeing how much of a role geography plays. One biblical scholar called the land of Israel the fifth gospel. And in a way, it really is, because it tells the story of Jesus's life and mission and what he came to do and to fulfill through his death and resurrection. All right, and so there's one scholar who I want to mention named Patrick Schreiner, and the worst part about him is that he's the son of the guy that I studied at, meaning that he was a kid when I knew him, and then he grew up and became a biblical scholar, and so it just proves I'm getting old. All right, so anyway, but he writes this very important little essay about geography of restoration. Here's some comments that he makes, and they're relevant to what we're talking about. He says, the geography in the ancient Near East was a physical representation of a transcendent reality. In other words, it's not just Jesus traveling around, going places. It is that, but it's more than that. It is doing something. He also says it's mapping things geographically was a visible form of Israel's theology. That is so important to understanding this gospel, mapping things geographically rather, was a visible form of Israel's theology. And then thirdly, he writes, geography is not only a setting for history, but an articulation of theology and history. So those are hugely important concepts to wrap your head around. And my only regret is that I didn't think of saying that first. So it's really important that we understand that when we read the story. Now, does that observation guarantee that you'll end up with the right conclusions? No, not necessarily, because at the end of the day, I still don't think that Schreiner gets that Jesus is going to physically restore the kingdom. But that's another discussion. I can't pick on everybody at the same time. All right, so, but let me show you some just real quick geographical references where we see how many times the land is mentioned and how it plays a part in the story. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I want you to see it. Matthew 2:6, excuse me, talks about Bethlehem in the land of Judah. That's not a throwaway detail. That is a significant observation about it being in the, excuse me, about the birth of Messiah being in the land of Judah. Chapter 2, verse 20 and 21. He says, the land of Israel. It's nothing worse than getting hiccups when you're talking on Zoom. Anyway, I'm immortalizing it. Excuse me, 1 second. Chapter 4, verse 12, Jesus withdrew to Galilee and moved to Capernaum. More on that in a minute. Very important detail. Matthew 4, verse 13. It says the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali. Matthew 4, verse 15 repeats a similar phrase, the land of Zebulun and Naphtali. It's remarkable, when people say there's not much discussion about the land, it's sort of like willful blindness that people just simply choose not to see it. It's living in denial. Matthew 17, verse 1, Jesus led the disciples up a high mountain. Again, it may just sound like a geographical marker, but it is profoundly important once you dig into its background. Matthew 19:1, he left Galilee and went to the region of Judea. Chapter 26, verse 32. Jesus will go before and meet his disciples in the Galilee. You get the idea that the Galilee was an important place. 28, verse 7. The resurrected Jesus will meet his disciples in the Galilee. And finally, the resurrected Jesus meets his disciples in the Galilee. So all these little references to the Galilee are loaded as you analyze these particular passages with theologically charged geographical information. But we're going to only look at a couple examples of that, but I wanted to see how profound some of these references are, which brings us, before I go on, any comments, questions?
No.
Okay, all right, good. All right, so now I want to talk about what one scholar calls Matthew's bi-referential use of the Hebrew Bible, of the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, or what I call the First Testament. All right, so the question is, Matthew's gospel is, comment first. Matthew's gospel contains, as we mentioned last week, more references in the Hebrew Bible than any of the other gospels. But there are 10 quotations, or actually 10 to 14, depending on how you're calculating, where you have these quotations that are contained in these specific formulas, these formula quotations. So the question is, how is Matthew using these quotations? So the answer to that is that Matthew's fulfillment quotations are, again, bi-referential, functioning on both a narrative and theological level. By the way, could you check your microphones? I think somebody's got an open mic. If you could mute that for me, I'd appreciate it. When I was teaching at a college in New York City, when I would get to this part in Matthew's gospel, I would tell the class, I said, this question will be on the exam. I promise you, it will be there. And if everybody in the class gets it correctly, I will buy pizzas for everybody. Now, I had some big classes, like 30 students, I think, one time. Do you know how many times I bought pizza for this question? Never, never did anybody get it. No matter how many times I stressed it and beat it into the ground, did everybody get this answer? The good news is it saved me a lot of money, but unfortunately, not everyone got this, which broke my heart. But like I said, I didn't have to buy pizza. But it's profoundly important. So if you all get this question right, I will buy pizzas when I'm in town. All right. Let's unpack what we mean by that. And so to do that, we're going to look at two passages. One located geographically in Jerusalem, and the other located in the Galilee. And so, of course, this picture, again, we could just spend an hour talking about this. We're looking at the Golden Dome, the Dome of the Rock, which happens to be sitting on the Temple Mount. And that big plaza was built by, anybody know who built the plaza? The plaza itself was built by none other than Herod the Great, one of his incredibly significant building accomplishments. So again, a lot of history there. I won't get bogged down, but it is a fascinating discussion. Okay, so let's dive in. So we're going to talk about, in the time we have, how much time do we have? Wow, time's rolling by. We're going to talk about the virginal conception of Jesus. Technically, just as a little freebie, it's not the virgin birth of Jesus, because the birth itself was the old-fashioned way. It was the conception that was unique. But we're going to talk about the virginal conception of Jesus, and we're going to use that as a mechanism to discover, or a tool to discover Matthew's theology of Israel. So if you've got your Bible, I want you to turn to Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. All right, so beginning in verse 18, now the birth of Jesus the Messiah was as follows. When his mother Mary, or Miriam, had been betrothed to Joseph, before they come together, she was found to be with child by the Holy Spirit. And Joseph, her husband, being a righteous man and not wanting to disgrace her, desired to put her away secretly. But when he had considered this, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for that which has been conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. And then we have a quote, and she will bear a son, and you will call his name Jesus, for it is he who will save his people from their sins. Now, all this took place, that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled, saying, behold, the virgin will be with child and shall bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which translated means God with us. And Joseph arose from his sleep and did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and took her as his wife, and kept her a virgin until she gave birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus. Well, in the Greek, he called his name Yeshua, or Jesus, or in Hebrew, Yeshua. All right, so probably one of the most famous verses, passages rather, in the New Testament. How many times have you read that? Like at least 40 times in your life, right? Probably. And of course, when you read this, suddenly you can hear all this Christmas music going on in the back of your head. So try to stop that, because No, you can do that all you want. All right, so let's unpack what's going on here. All right, so remember, we're focusing on these fulfillment quotations from the Hebrew Bible and their bi-referential function. Excuse me. I'll edit that later. Okay, so what did we read? Let's review the narrative. Pretty straightforward, isn't it? It says, an angel of the Lord appears to Joseph in a dream and comforts him concerning Mary's virginal conception. He instructs Joseph to name the child Jesus, or Yeshua, as his mom actually called him, because, quote, he will save his people from their sins. So this verse will get quoted several times. Then we have in verses 22 through 23 what scholars refer to as a fulfillment quotation or a fulfillment citation. And so you have this formula in verse 22 that says something like this: all this took place to fulfill what the Lord spoke. Do you see that? It's easily not noticed if you're not paying attention, but there it is. And he does this, Matthew does this about 10 times. The same thing happens 3 times in the mouth of people in the story who are mostly the enemies of Jesus. And then 1 time, I believe you have a quote from Jesus himself using that phrase. So you can calculate it 10 to 14 times in total. But so we have this fulfillment quotation in Matthew where he says, this happened in order to fulfill that. And then you have the quotation itself, Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, the sign of Emmanuel's birth. And of course, pretty much everybody reads this and we say it's about what? About what? About the virgin birth. And this becomes a focal point of many a sermon, not just at Christmas, but evangelistically as well, right? But there is so much more going on here. Now, is he talking about the virgin conception of Jesus? Absolutely, no taking away from that. But there's a lot more going on. But in order to understand it, we need to unpack the passage. Now, in order to understand, this is so important, in order to understand how Matthew is using these quotations, we need to appeal to pop culture a little bit. So, can you think of any phrase or line from a movie that if you say it, everybody on this Zoom will know exactly what you're talking about, who said it, what's about, where it's taking place, et cetera, and so forth? Anybody, can you give me any examples? What's your
You've got mail.
yes, very good. Thank you, David. Was that you that said that? Yes.
Yeah.
Very good. You've got mail. All right, somebody else. What was that from?
For the movie You Got Mail.
Yeah.
No.
Was it Sleepless in Seattle?
Yes, you've got mail, but that was Sleepless in Seattle, right? That was the name of it. Yes, good. Starring who?
Tom Hanks.
Right, and who else?
Meg Ryan.
Right.
Yeah,
Meg Ryan.
look, from a single phrase, you got all that information. How about this one? Frankly, Scarlett. I just said 2 words.
Gone with
Gone
the
with the
Wind.
Wind.
Gone with the
The
Wind.
Winds.
Starring.
Oh, I don't know.
Oh wow, you guys are aging yourself.
Uh,
Clark Gable, right? And
Yeah, Clark Gable.
And Vivian Ray.
Vivian Ray, right? Olivia de Havilland. There you go.
Yeah.
All through just giving you a phrase. I used to really drive my students nuts on this I've really never seen this show, but there was a show called The Office. Anybody watch that?
Yes. I don't watch it. I don't like it.
Yeah, you should repent if you've seen it. I've literally never. but there was a phrase in there, and there was a questionable phrase, which I had no idea. I really had no idea what it meant when I said it in the beginning. By my like 10th year of teaching, I finally knew what it was, because the students would get so angry to make me to deny that I knew what it was. But I will not repeat the phrase because it's a little off colored. You can figure it out. But it drove them insane that I did not know what this phrase meant. But even though I said I didn't know what it was and I wouldn't say the phrase, they still know what phrase I was talking about, and they can tell me everything about it. That is exactly how Matthew's fulfillment quotations work. Not about risque lines from TV series, but they
Right.
function in a way of evoking the citation's larger context. So Matthew doesn't just want us to think about the Alma, the young maiden, or the virgin. He wants us to get the whole story. So what is the whole story going on here? Well, let's unpack it a little bit. This is a bulla. Anybody know what a bulla is? It's a clay seal impression that were put on scrolls when they were delivered. Now, there were a lot of these found in the old city of David in Jerusalem. That when the city was burned down, the scrolls themselves were destroyed. But what happened was the clay seals were hardened and preserved. So it's amazing. A lot of these seals confirm the biblical story. And this seal is, I don't think this was one from the city of Jerusalem. I think there's some intrigue behind it. I think it was owned by or in the possession of a antiquities dealer of some. There was some questionable story about how he acquired it. But anyway, this is the clay seal, and in Proto-Hebrew. This is what biblical Hebrew, before you have the modern characters, look like. It's basically illegible if you've not, even if you read modern biblical Hebrew or modern Hebrew. These characters are different, but if you know them, you could make it out. But it says belonging to Ahaz, son of Jehotam, king of Judah. All that to say, we could break down this story in four movements. Chapters 7 through 9 of Isaiah cover the Assyrian invasion and deportation of the kingdom of Judah and Israel, or of Israel and partially of Judah. But what I want to begin by looking at what we'll call in verses chapters 1 through 17, the moment of decision. Now, we don't have time to read all 3 chapters, lucky for you, but we can dive down a couple times and pick up some important points. And namely, what is this story about? It's about King Ahaz of Judah. Let's look at verses 1 through 4. So Isaiah chapter 7, 1 through 4. So Isaiah chapter 7, 1 through 4. Now it came about in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, that Rezin, the king of Aram, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up to Jerusalem to wage war against it, but could not conquer it. When it was reported to the house of David, the Arameans have camped in Ephraim, the heart and the hearts of his heart and the hearts of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake with wind. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, "Go now to Ahaz, you and your son, Sha'ar Yashuv, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the fuller's field, and say to them, take care and be calm, have no fear, and do not be faint-hearted because of these two stubs of smoldering firebrands, on account of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram and the son of Remaliah." Okay, so what's going on here? You've got Ahaz of Judah and what we'll call the Syro-Ephraimite coalition, composed of Pekah of Israel, the king of the northern kingdom. Remember, now Israel is divided into half. You've got Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south, and you've got Rezin in Damascus, the ruler of Damascus. Now, it doesn't tell us in Isaiah exactly what's going on, but we can extrapolate it from a couple of other texts, and it fits perfectly with this story. Well, what is going on? These two kings have formed a coalition, and they've come knocking on the doorstep of Judah because they want him to join the coalition. Why? Because of this guy, who is none other than clearly he's an alien, because you can see his wrist. You see the wristwatch. Never mind, wristwatch. Forget it. Old alien joke.
Ashurbanipal.
Yeah. Actually, yes, it's Tiglath. Is that another name for Tiglath-Pileser? It is, right? Or not? I don't think it is. Is it? But this one, I believe, is Tiglath. Should be Tiglath-Pileser the third. He can by a couple of different names. I'm not sure if that's who this one is, but it might be. In any event, that's who he's representing here in this example. And what did he do? He was the ruler of the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrian Empire was the mega rising superpower of the ancient Near East. And he was on a mission to conquer this region. And he was sweeping into this area and conquering everything. And so Ephraim and Syria formed a coalition to stand up to him, but they weren't strong enough to do it on their own. So they were going to enlist Judah to join their coalition. Well, Ahaz didn't want to do that. So what did he do? Did he cry out to the God of Israel? You know, the Judean kings are supposed to be the good kings. In general, that's true, but not Ahaz. Actually, he's a pretty bad guy. He actually, either somebody's barking or their dog is barking, but please mute your mic. But he actually sacrificed one of his sons to the pagan gods. So clearly not one of the best kings, but he was not very faithful. And so God sent Isaiah to him to admonish him. If you look at verse 6, so we read earlier where God sends Isaiah to Ahaz and to the nation who are afraid because this coalition is camped out at the gate of Jerusalem. And he sends them there. Look at verse 6. This is very important. Isaiah 7, verse 6. Well, actually, I think I got the verse wrong. Where did it go? Well, he says, they say, let us go up against Judah and terrorize it and make for ourselves a breach in the walls and set up the son of Tabael as king in the midst of it. Now, what was the problem with that? It was bad enough that they were coming to break the walls down, but what were they going to do? They were going to install this other guy, and this other guy was what? He was not from the house of David, which would basically dissolve this promise that the king of Israel would always be from the house of David. So in verse 9, Isaiah admonishes. So he comes to Judah, he comes to Ahaz, and he admonishes them and says, do not be afraid. Look at verse verse 8 of chapter 7. For the head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. Now within another 65 years, Ephraim will be shattered, so that it is no longer a people. And the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. And then listen to this very sort of cryptic statement. If you, meaning Ahaz and Judah, if you will not believe, you surely shall not last. In Hebrew, it's a word play. So he says, if you don't believe, if you don't have faith, you will not survive this experience. And then God says to, if you've read the story, God says to Ahaz, okay, you don't believe that I'll rescue you. He says, ask whatever you want from me, any sign. And what does Ahaz says? He says, oh, I will not test the Lord. I'm not going to ask for a sign. Well, of course, that was his very sanctimonious response. It wasn't true. He didn't even believe. Why? Because we know that Ahaz, faced with this crisis of this coalition at his door, what does he do? Does he cry out to the God of Israel? No, he goes to Tiglath-Pileser III to ask for help. He goes to the enemy of everybody and asks this guy to deliver him. But in any event, Isaiah says, all right, you're not going to ask for a sign. God is going to give you one anyway. Now, this is where we finally get to our verse about Emmanuel. So look at verse 14 and verse 15. Look what he says. Well, back it up a little bit in verse 12. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord, very sanctimonious. Then he said, listen now, O house of David, is it too slight a thing that you try the patience of men, that you will try the patience of my God as well? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a Alma, a virgin, is one way to translate it, or a young maiden of marriageable age, implying that she's a virgin, will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. Notice that Matthew changes the citation a little bit, that you will call his name Emmanuel. And then in verse 15, he says, he will eat curds and honey. At the time, he knows enough to refuse evil and to choose good. For before the boy will know enough to refuse evil and choose good, the land which the two kings you dread will be forsaken. All right, so what is going on here? Verse 14, you have this sign of what? Of Emmanuel's birth, which is, who is that individual? Of course, you know this is an endless debate among New Testament scholars. What are the possibilities? It could be referring specifically to this prophetic event in the far distant future and only that. This is a view held by a couple of scholars, and that would be obviously a reference to Jesus. Other scholars say it refers to some poor unknown woman just standing there who happened to be pregnant or that would be pregnant shortly. And he's pointing at her and she's going, why are you talking about me? Or thirdly, some scholars argue that this would be Ahaz's wife, and she's pointing to and Isaiah is referring to the queen, and that he's ultimately talking about the birth of Hezekiah, Ahaz's son. So anyway, the point is that in verse 14, it's this promise of blessing. If you believe that I will rescue you and deliver you, do not be afraid, because your enemies will be destroyed. It will be a sign of blessing. But this prophecy is a two-edged sword, because verse 15 says what? He talks about this child eating curds and honey. At the time, he knows enough to refuse evil and to choose good. Now, what is this reference about curds and honey about? When we talk about milk and honey, usually what are we thinking about?
The land of Israel.
Right, the land of Israel. And is it a good thing or a bad thing?
Good thing. Canaan, promise of the promised land, Canaan.
Right. That's normally what we think it is, right? I agree. That's usually what people arrive at, but not in this context. Because, when was it a good thing for the land to be flowing with milk and honey? When they entered the promised land and the nation was a bunch of herders, and the economy was primarily pastoral, following their sheep or whatnot around. But by now, it's quite a bit later in Israel's history, and they are living in walled cities with gates and homes. Well, what would happen if you see curds, or in other words, it's like, what's this a picture of, curds and honey or milk and honey? It's, in other words, like a lot of vegetation, a lot of plants that yield honey of some sort, right? That's the idea. So what would you conclude if you saw all this wild plant life growing and flowers growing in your city? It's like, again, showing that I watch too many movies. What was that movie with Will Smith about? He's walking through Manhattan. He's living in Manhattan with a bunch of zombies, and the city's overgrown. There's like What's that?
I'm Legend. I'm Legend.
Yes, right. Very good. Thank you. Yes. Somebody's watching too many movies, I have to say. But anyway, right. So in other words, what is that a sign of? It's a sign of destruction and
Judgment.
right? This God,
Right.
so God is saying, because you did not believe, you will suffer the consequences. God will allow Jerusalem to be destroyed or sacked, and the whole kingdom to suffer the consequences. So the sign of Emmanuel, see, it's not just about this birth, but people get fixated on whether it's, or not just about this one word. It's about the whole prophecy. And he's saying, if you believe, it will be a sign of blessing. But if you don't believe and you didn't believe, it will be a sign of judgment. And of course, that's exactly what Ahaz did. We read about that in 2 Kings verse 7, where he healed. Somebody's got their mic open. Could you shut that, please? Mute your microphone. So that's exactly what Ahaz did. He appealed to Tiglath-Pileser III to deliver him from this coalition instead of crying out to God. And so God says, you are going to go into exile. And that's exactly what happened. So, and it talks about the gentle water. Well, look at verses of chapter 8, verses 6 through 7. So God sends the nation, or he allows, actually, he says Judah or Israel will go into, the northern kingdom will go into exile, but the southern kingdom will not escape God's judgment as well. Look what it says in verses, let's see, in verses, beginning in verse 6 of chapter 8. Inasmuch as these people have rejected the gentle flowing waters of the Shiloah and rejoice in Rezin, the son of Remaliah, now therefore, behold, the Lord is about to bring on them the strong and abundant waters of the Euphrates, even the king of Assyria and all his glory, and it will rise up over all its channels and go over all its banks. Then it will sweep on into Judah. It will overflow and pass through. It will reach even to the neck, and the spread of its wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. There we have another reference to Emmanuel. So what is that about? Well, so where are the waters of Shiloah? Does anyone know? Well, so where did Jerusalem at this time get its water? From the Gishon spring, where they built a water a protection of that water out that was located outside the gate. Hezekiah will eventually build a underground tunnel to bring that water into the city so it won't be exposed outside. But where that water would terminate in the Shiloah pool, the pool of Siloam, in other words, that we would know it by. So, but this water trickled. It was like sort of just a slow, flow kind of water. And they didn't put their faith in God's provision, in other words. Instead, they feared the mighty waters of the Euphrates. In other words, the king of Assyria. He's compared to like this giant, roaring, powerful river that flows. And God will judge Israel, or the Syro-Ephraimite coalition, meaning Israel as in the northern kingdom. They go into exile. But because Judah did not respond with faith, God also allows them to be subjugated, and they're reduced to a vassal state. But the water, we're told, will overflow its banks, spread out throughout the land, even to the neck, meaning the water will flood the land of Judah to the neck. In other words, a little remnant will survive, will be preserved. It will not be completely drowned. And then you have this very strange reference here again, back to Emmanuel. The water will cover the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. This reference to Emmanuel that we were talking about earlier. A reminder that this is the land of Emmanuel. Even in exile and subjugation, Emmanuel is with his people. This is Emmanuel's land. All right, now, the story's been pretty depressing so far, but this is, if I was making a movie, oh, by the way, a little technical information for you. This gives you an example of what I was talking about. And so we know from history that Tiglath-Pileser conducted a Galilee campaign, and he took out the Hula Valley, which is up here. And he conquered the Galilee as well as the Gilead, which was on the side over here. And the northern kingdom, which, remember, the northern kingdom went way up here, but it was reduced to a truncated vassal state. It was just conquered. It began to be conquered, and eventually it will be completely taken away into exile. But Judah, the southern kingdom, was also subjugated and reduced to a vassal state. They don't vanish as early as the northern kingdom does, but they are conquered and reduced to a vassal state. And of course, later during the Babylonian exile, they themselves will be taken into exile as well. So it's just not working out well for the nation. And by the way, here is, just to give a little historical background context. This is the city gate of Chatzor, one of the three fortified cities of Solomon that we read about in, I think it's 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 15. It might be 2 Kings. But you can see the gates have been on the right. You can see these 3 chambers on each side, this 6-chambered gate. This is what it looked like when it was still standing. Tiglath-Pileser just destroys everything, and it's never rebuilt. Here's just another picture of it, so you get an idea of the destruction. Or this is what it looked like when it was rebuilt, actually. But you can, when you come visit in Israel, I'll give you the grand tour. Well, anyway, the story is very depressing so far, but do not despair. And this is where, if we were making a movie, someday Steven Spielberg will become a believer and make this great movie. This is where, the director says, cue music, and the cue lights, and all this darkness starts to depart, and the music starts to rise a little bit, because look what happens in verse 9. This is where it gets exciting. It gets a little scary, then it gets exciting. Verse 9. Be broken. So he's been talking about all this negativity so far about what's happening in Judah. And he's telling Judah all these terrible things are going to happen. But then the context switches. Look at verse 9. Isaiah turns from talking to Judah and faces the nations that are about to do their worst. Look what he says. Be broken, O peoples, and be shattered, and give ear all remote places of the earth. Gird yourselves, yet be shattered. Gird yourselves, yet be shattered. Devise a plan. It was verse 10, sorry. Devise a plan, but it will be thwarted. State a proposal, but it will not stand. For God is with us. Again, you have this in Hebrew, Emmanuel. So God is saying, or Isaiah is saying on God's behalf to the nations, go ahead, make your plans, do your worst, devise your military schemes and warfare. It will not last. Why? Because God is with us. Even in exile, God is with the people of Israel. And so I won't read this whole section for the sake of time, but this little section is ultimately about, it's a little cryptic to understand, but it's about the remnant that is preserved even in exile. But then in chapter 9, verses 1 through 7, it talks about the glorious restoration, about those who have been sitting in darkness. Now, I've left it blank on purpose because we'll come back to that in a minute. But trust me, it's a great ending because God will gather the exiles and restore them to the land. Okay, all that to say, how does this bring us back to Matthew? Well, here's how it works. So what happened on a narrative level? How did Matthew use Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14? On a narrative level, Isaiah 7:14 validates the story of Jesus's miraculous birth, right? Mary becomes pregnant. Joseph is freaked out. God sends him a dream and says, do not be afraid. This birth is by the Holy Spirit, and you will name him, the virgin will conceive and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. So it moves the narrative along. Well, that's what happens on a narrative level, but on a theological level, on the deep substructure of the story, it invokes that Deuteronomic meta-narrative that we talked about earlier. And on a theological level, Isaiah 7:14 evokes the citation's larger context in which national judgment and purification of a righteous remnant precedes the nation's political restoration. And that is how Matthew is using this citation to move the story along on a narrative level, but on a deeper level, he's signaling the reader that something is happening, that God is once again moving to rescue his people. But once again, the people of Israel are faced with a moment of decision. What will you do with God's deliverance? Will you obey? Will you believe? Will you be rescued from judgment, from this time ultimate eschatological judgment? Or will you respond in unbelief and suffer exile and ultimate judgment and disaster? So that's how it's working on this level in this text. So this is, in other words, this is all about the land and all about God's promises. But if you're not sold yet, there's another text we have to look at. So, but any questions about this text before we go on? So yes, Isaiah 7:14 is about the Alma that will conceive and bear a child, but that's not the whole package. You have to read it in its larger context. It is about God giving Israel yet one more moment of decision to respond to. And if they respond the right way, he will deliver the nation and he will rescue them, not just from individual personal sin, but from their individual personal sin in the context of the nation's national sin, and restore the nation. Okay, any quick question about that? You guys are all so quiet. All right, we'll have to work on interpersonal arguing. Okay, so which brings us to the next citation, chapter 4, verse 12 through 17. Now, we didn't talk about it, but in the middle of this, between these two chapters, is you have a reference to where the Magi visit, come to visit the child born King of the Jews, and Herod, of course, tries to kill him. But the quotations there are involving the shepherd king who will rescue the nation. But that's for another discussion. I allude to it because I talked about the arrival of the shepherd king. This is about the arrival of the shepherd king, and it goes into more detail about that in chapter 2, but we're not going to dive there. We're going to pick it up here at chapter 4, verses 12 through 17. And here you can see this picture of the Galilee. I took this picture from the Arbel mountain, which is, remember when we're looking at that picture of the Galilee from the other direction, you can see that mountain at the bottom of which is the city of Magdala. And this, you can see the Galilee, that half of the Galilee, that little quarter of the Galilee, is where 80% of the gospel story takes place. It all unfolds there. All these cities and villages in the Galilee are found here that are so important to the story. All right, so we'll be a little quicker this time as we're running out of time quickly, but now look at Matthew chapter 4, verses 12 through 17. And this pattern repeats again of the narrative, the fulfillment formula, and the quotation. Matthew chapter 4, verses 12 through 17. It says, now when he, meaning Jesus, heard that John had been taken into custody, he withdrew into Galilee. And leaving Nazareth, he came and settled in Capernaum, which is by the sea in the region. This translation says region, but I would translate it territory, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali. This was to fulfill what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet, saying, the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, by way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, the Galilee of the Gentiles, the people who were sitting in darkness saw great light, and to those who were sitting in the land and in the shadow of death, upon them a light has dawned. Now, most scholars just zoom right over that and focus on this singular phrase, the Galilee of the Gentiles, and they draw the conclusion this is about God's decision to bring the gospel to the Gentiles. Now, don't get me wrong, God loves the Gentiles. He made so many of you, but that is not what this passage is about. Let's unpack it a little. So again, we have the narrative, which is basically what we read. When Jesus heard of John the Baptist's arrest, he withdrew to the Galilee. He left Nazareth and went and lived in Capernaum in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali. Now, why are Zebulun and Naphtali so important to our story? Anybody know? All right, well, let's find out. Well, again, so you have this fulfillment quotation in verse 14 about in order that this might be fulfilled, this very important word in Greek in Matthew's gospel, plerao, which means fulfill. It works without any problem here. It gets sticky in chapter 5, verse 17, where it's talking about fulfilling the law, but that's another discussion. All right, and so then you have this quote from Isaiah 9, 1 and 2 about the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the territory of Zebulun and the territory of Naphtali. Why is it important? Again, the shoreline, which is speaking in a geographical, geographical way. It's speaking truth. Here is a picture of the Capernaum synagogue. You can see the limestone synagogue. So why is that important? Because Jesus, we know, preached in the synagogue in Capernaum. The white limestone synagogue is from the 4th century. the basalt foundation below it, a lot of people think that is actually from the first century synagogue. That basalt is probably not, but the foundation below it, the basalt cobblestone, is, I would say, absolutely the first century synagogue that Jesus preached in and taught in. All right, anyway, so again, we need to think about our little pattern, the moment of decision. Israel made the wrong decision, or Judah made the wrong decision. But even in judgment, God preserved the faithful remnant, and he promised to restore them, which brings us to Israel's glorious restoration in chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. And here's, I quote it in full here because it's so important. But there were, by the way, when we think of Isaiah chapter 9, what is the one verse that we think about at Christmas, right? The Hallelujah chorus, verse 6, but we skip verses 1 and 2. Verse 6, wonderful counselor, mighty God, Prince of Peace, and he shall, sorry, I can't sing, I won't do it. But Isaiah 9, 1 and 2, but there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. Why? What is this so significant about the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali? Zebulun and Naphtali were the first two tribes to go into exile, the first two territories going to exile. So where did the exile begin? In the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, in the tribal region of Zebulun and Naphtali. Where does Matthew reveal will the restoration of Israel begin? In the exact same place, the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time, he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. You can translate it Galilee of the Gentiles, but it's the idea of the nations that had occupied the Galilee once the region was subjugated and driven the Jews out. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of deep darkness, on them a light has shone. In other words, as I said, the restoration of Israel begins right here from Matthew's perspective. With the arrival of Jesus in the Galilee, the restoration of Israel has begun. So what's going on? On a narrative level, Isaiah 9, 1 and 2 validates the account of Jesus's or Yeshua's move to Capernaum. On a theological level, it does even more, again, triggering that Deuteronomic meta-narrative. On a theological, Isaiah 9, 1 and 2 evokes the citation's larger context that depicts the end of God's judgment and the restoration of the righteous remnant to the promised land. So that's what Matthew wants us to glean from his quotation, not simply that Jesus moved to the Galilee. And here you can see it sort of mapped out. You can see, I think you can see my little arrow moving. Nazareth is in guess what territory? In the territory of Zebulun. And where was Capernaum? In the territory, the tribal region of Naphtali. So he is walking his theology. He's bringing it into reality. So again, on a narrative level, Jesus moves from Nazareth to Capernaum. On a theological level, the restoration of Israel begins where the exile began, in the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. And so with regard to fulfillment, Jesus's arrival, so here's where I took that picture from up here looking down the Galilee, way up here. Jesus' arrival in Capernaum symbolically or proleptically, doing it in advance, proleptically reclaims territory lost due to foreign invasion and inaugurates, it doesn't consummate it, it inaugurates the eschatological restoration of Israel. Zooming back and looking at the big picture, Isaiah 7:14 talks about the birth of Emmanuel. Isaiah 9, 1 and 2 talks about the restoration of the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun from exile. Well, Matthew 1 talks about the birth of Emmanuel and the moment of decision faced by the nation. Matthew 4, verses 15 and 16 talks also about the restoration of the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali by the Messiah of Israel himself. So that is an example of Matthew's fulfillment quotations, how they work, but it's also an example of Matthew's geography or theogeography of restoration. And that is such an important point in understanding Matthew's gospel of and Matthew's theology of Israel.